What caught my attention was an incident that happened in Duisburg. We're speaking about mafia organizations as organizations that are defined by their political and economic power. So many years later, one of the people that had sued her at the time is now one of the people that has been arrested and is actually on trial in Italy. I am now much more aware of the fact that, of course, there is a big capacity problem in all of our countries to deal with this problem.
Welcome to Underworlds from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My name is Mark Shaw. In today's episode, I speak to Sanne De Boer, who's a courageous Dutch journalist who relocated to Calabria and wrote a book called Mafiopoli, which is a story of the Ndrangheta. It's a slightly different story from other accounts. For a start, Sanne is something of an insider-outsider. She's well integrated into Calabrian society while not being a local. And she begins to write the book based on a set of incidents that occur around her. What's really important about the book, in my view, is not only is it a story about the role and growth of the Calabrian Mafia, but it is also looking at its connections, the Ndrangheta, its connections into Germany and the Netherlands. She focuses on a particular massacre in the town of Duisburg in Germany, and she draws on that to show how unprepared the authorities in the wider European continent have been for the growth of the Italian mafia. It's a fascinating and, again, courageous piece of work by an investigative journalist. Sanne, welcome. Sanne, the book has a very interesting title, Mafiopoli. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, but tell us a little bit about the background to the title of the book.
Sure, the word Mafiopoli means a place governed by the mafia's interests. It was actually used by a very iconic Sicilian anti-mafia activist, Peppino Impastato, who used it to sort of mock the mafia interests in his village. The reason I chose it for the title of the book is because I really wanted to stress the political aspect of mafia power. It's sort of an aspect that is less well known to a Dutch audience and a non-Italian audience. So I wanted to really stress that aspect, the way the mafia can influence society through this political power.
Sanne, the book, what's interesting in my reading of it is actually it's a bit of a personal story too. You moved to Calabria, you settled into a small village, you came upon the mafia, so to speak, and you then began to get an interest. You moved away, you moved back. I mean, tell us something about, if you like, the life of the book, your own life, but the life of your book intermingled with your engagements in and around Calabria.
Yes, of course. Well, I have decided to write the book after having lived in Calabria for at least 10 years. I didn't want to rush into the topic, of course. I had been making reports about the topic for Dutch media, for television and radio, and for print media, so for newspapers. But I came to the conclusion that these reports didn't allow for a lot of space to go deeper into the more complicated reality, and also especially to speak about the sort of inconvenient truth about the fact that our country, the Netherlands, and our neighboring countries such as Belgium and Germany are a very important factor in the success of the Ndrangheta. They smuggle a lot of cocaine through our countries, especially the Netherlands and Belgium. And in a way, as a Dutch person living in Calabria, I felt that I had a sort of a responsibility to emphasize this reality, to speak about it. And so I decided to write this book and to also make myself a figure in the story. It felt a bit, it would felt cowardly, maybe even to exclude myself from the story. And I hope that it also helps people to relate to the subject, to make it become a little bit more closer to their reality. The fact that I, as a privileged outsider, speak about this problem. However, I do know the region I have known that region for a long time. I've seen daily life there. I've seen the struggles there. I've seen a lot of courageous examples of people speaking out. And that's also a reality I really wanted to stress in this book.
So, Sanne, it comes across really well, I have to say, and you don't overdo your presence in the book, but you are there, and that's a sort of guiding narrative, which I must say personally is very interesting and sometimes unusual. I think at least in accounts of the mafia. But maybe just before we move on, the book, you move to the village, but you don't immediately meet the mafia. You recount the mafia or the Ndrangheta. And just explain how it became more and more of a presence, or your knowledge of its presence became greater, and then that influenced your decision to work on the subject.
Well, it's not a subject that is easily spoken about in Calabrian society, of course, although that is definitely changing. I've seen this change. People are becoming a lot more outspoken about it in recent years, which I think is a very good development. But at the time, and this is, we're speaking now, we're talking about more than 15 years ago now, I had trouble finding people who I would be also comfortable speaking about this topic to, and who would be able to explain this situation to me. I did, however, read a lot of things, of course, in the newspapers, and I was able to understand more and more about it with time. What caught my attention was an incident that happened in Duisburg, which it happened during my first summer in Calabria, which was in August 2007. What happened was that 6 men were shot in front of a restaurant in the city center of Duisburg. Actually, it was a restaurant that was on the ground floor of a very big office building, the biggest office building of the city. And these killings were connected to a feud in Calabria, in San Luca, which is a well-known village for people who know a little bit about the Ndrangheta, because a lot of clans connected to these villages are often in the news. So what happened was, in a way, Germany woke up to the reality of the presence of the mafia in their country. Duisburg is a city that is only about a half an hour away from the border with Netherlands, and it revealed also the connection to the Netherlands, especially after one of the killers of the Duisburg murders was found in a suburb of Holland, of the Amsterdam. So I was I woke up to the reality of this Calabrian mafia that had a lot of business in the Netherlands, in Germany, a reality that was not easy to sort of penetrate or come to grips with at the time. But as I learned more and more, I found out what was actually happening, of course. And this was one of the most important reasons, I think, that I became interested in the topic as well. I would have become more and more interested just living in Calabria for sure, but the fact that there was a connection to Holland, such a strong connection, made it even more important or urgent for me to find out more about it.
Sonia, actually, this is a very interesting part of the book, because it's not only about the Ndrangheta in its Calabrian setting, although you are there. It's very much about the expansion of organized crime in Europe. And you use the massacre you've described in Duisburg in Germany as a kind of thread that runs through it. You explain, or you cover, there's a very interesting section around a particular German journalist, which I want to get to. But before moving on, maybe just to explain, because the book has a very readable history of the Calabrian Mafia. And it's probably a good place to start, maybe for you just to recount that, where it developed from, how it's evolved, its expansion into Europe, just as a sort of scene setter for the book as a whole.
A lot of people around the world have known about the presence or the existence of the Sicilian Mafia, Cosa Nostra, and Mafia of Campania, which is the Camorra. These are much more well-known mafias than the Ndrangheta. Maybe in recent years we hear a lot more about the Ndrangheta, but 20 years ago this was very different. And so this is very much connected to its success. The Ndrangheta has has made a very strategic choice to avoid violence in abroad. And then, of course, this sounds like a contradiction to what I've just said about the Duisburg massacre, but this was definitely an exception that sort of proves the rule. They avoid using violence abroad, especially abroad. They do avoid also using violence against important state figures in Italy, although there are definitely exceptions to that rule. But they've made different choices than, for instance, Cosa Nostra, who had waged a sort of open war against the state in the 80s and 90s and got a very a big blow from law enforcement because of that. During those years, especially in the 90s, the Ndrangheta has grown very much in their drug trafficking, their international drug trafficking, and so they did this in a very smart way by, of course, staying under the radar and um, integrating very well also in foreign societies, I guess.
Basically, you describe the historical development, basically making the argument that the Ndrangheta is different from the Cosa Nostra and the Camorra, and it's now become extremely powerful because of that. So maybe just for a wider audience, the Duisburg massacre was covered a lot, obviously in the German and I guess the Italian press. But just give us, I mean, who was killing whom? Why did that massacre take place in Germany? It clearly shook the German establishment. Just give us a little bit of background on that, because as I read it, it was a reflection of the expansion of the Ndrangheta and conflict related to that expansion. I mean, would that be broadly correct?
I think so. The So the massacre was connected to a very long feud that had been going on since the 91. I think it happened. It was a conflict between two clans in San Luca, and of course, these clans have both interest in drug trafficking, and they are both prominently present in especially that area of Germany and other areas of Germany, to be able to launder this money also in investments, through investments in maybe in various business sectors, but especially in restaurants and other hospitality sector investments. The actual shooting happened because of it was a reaction against a very tragic murder that had happened around Christmas time in Calabria. But of course, there was also it was a conflict that came out of some jealousy for in business.
It was a massacre related to internal tensions back home, and you describe it very well in the book, I have to say. Sanne, I mean, when you read about the Duisburg massacre, I mean, did you start covering it for the Dutch press? I mean, clearly the book is not about the massacre entirely, although it comes up in several places. But as you've said, it was the hook for you to write the book. Did you realize immediately that you would want to write around that? Was there a demand for more coverage?
Sure. I started writing about this the topic much later, actually. I didn't immediately decide to cover this for the Dutch press.
You read about it, it was covered in Calabria.
Yes, and of course, I tried to inform myself about it, but these things also have a very long. It's a very long process. Even just bringing the one of the killers to trial, the definite conviction of the murderer, took years and years, of course. So if you want to write about these stories and know a little bit more about developments and backgrounds, what is very what what is very interesting to me is that we still find in even in recent arrests the same clans come up in the arrests that are happening in Holland or mostly in Germany, Belgium. We're still talking about the same clans, and actually they've decided to collaborate again right after the Duisburg massacre. So I think it's even more revealing to know the current situation and to realize how well they've been able to stay put in this territory, actually, even after the Duisburg massacre happened.
Sonny, what for me was interesting apart from the tragedy of the massacre itself, was it was connected in and around a restaurant. I don't remember the exact details, but it took place either in the restaurant or close by. And you talk a lot about restaurant investments, actually, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and the connection to the Calabrian Mafia. Tell us about that.
Investigations do show that the Drangheta's investments in restaurants, also outside of Italy, are important to their business, let's say, in that they use these restaurants often as ways to connect with also important figures in local politics and local businesses. It's a way also to create an important network for them to grow, have more profit, and to, in a sense, also sometimes it's been shown in a recent investigation in Germany to organize their own impunity, which is of course very worrying, should be worrying to us. My real motivation is to have people think about uh, international organized crime as a way that can, in subtle ways, influence our own reality, our own daily lives as well. And to also maybe remind them of the fact that this is one of the problems we deal with today that is connected to all kinds of other problems. I must say, I really appreciated your report, Intersections, that shows the interconnectedness of organized crime with so many other problems we're dealing with today. So the fight against organized crime, it's necessary to have a solidarity, to have an international solidarity, as it is with all these other global problems that we're facing today, I feel. And so even if it is very specifically about the Ndrangheta, my intention was to sort of point your attention towards this reality.
Sonny, I mean, just to make it very clear, and I said it already. The book is the book is about more than Calabria. It's these connections to Germany and the Netherlands. And you say at several points in the book that neither the authorities in Germany, in particular, as I read it, but also the Netherlands, necessarily understood or were prepared for the level of the threat that the Ndrangheta faced in other countries. And give us some insights there. I mean, did this become clear to you talking to authorities in both of the other countries?
Yes, I remember also speaking. Of course, I had done a lot of research while writing the book. I had already studied so many court documents. I'd studied all these cases, and I remember also speaking to some Dutch investigators eh, who had done an investigation into the Ndrangheta in Holland, and well, realizing that it almost seemed as though I knew more about the subject than they did, and I was very surprised about this. And still, what I'm very surprised about, and also happy about, is that my book has found a lot of readers in law enforcement in Holland, and at least I'm not sure about the other countries. It's been translated also into German, and of course into English. I'm very happy about this because it allows me to also, some of these readers, they reach out to me, and the conversation that I have with them also make me more aware of the challenges that they face. And because maybe perhaps when I finished the book, I think I was a little bit naive, in a sense that I was hoping that when people would become more aware of this problem, it would really help them do something about it more easily. I am now much more aware of the fact that, of course, there is a big capacity problem in all of our countries to deal with this problem. Um, and also of the simple fact that the Drangheta is very lucky in a way with the way it's been doing its business, because avoiding violence obviously makes them less of a threat to our societies. And it is almost impossible for crime fighters to convince their superiors about the necessity to do something against these criminals in our countries. This is the unfortunate reality, and it's something that is understandable but still very frustrating and very unfortunate, especially because in a sense, with some more with international cooperation, it has been happening in our countries. We've had many we've had some very important investigations and some joint investigations teams from Eurojust that have proven to be able to do a lot more than had been happening in the past. Um, then again, I realize also from talking to crime fighters here, it's a very difficult problem to tackle.
You made this very interesting point for me, and given that this is a podcast about non-fiction books on organized crime, that a lot of your readers were in Dutch law enforcement, people who wanted some background to the issue, who wanted to understand some of the history and symbols of the Ndrangheta. I mean, what were those sorts of discussions like? Did these people come up to you when you presented the book in public, or people contacted you after they had read the book?
Well, actually, the book came out in Holland. It's already 4.5 years ago now. So it was we were in lockdown. Actually, we were in COVID. But a lot of people reached out to me through email or otherwise. And since we can meet people in public again, I've been meeting up with a lot of people. Also traveling through Germany and Holland to give presentations about this. So it's been very surprising to me actually that a lot of so many crime fighters really want to hear more about the topic. Tell me that they've actually changed the way they look at their work in some cases as well. Most interesting maybe is that they recognize a lot of these dynamics even in the groups that they study, which means that to me it says that. Mafia behavior or mafia tactics are, of course, more widespread than mafia clans themselves. Even regular organized crime groups do implement these tactics. Also, in that sense, it seems that it's been a helpful book for this public as well.
Parallel to that, Sanne, you tell the story of a German journalist, a Petra Reski, who I must say I didn't know much about at all, and she had written a book linked to the Duisburg Mafia massacre, and she had quite a hard time with her publication, and you recount that almost in parallel to your own story. It's quite an interesting way in which you've done it in the book. Tell us a little bit about Petra and the struggles she had, and whether that changed your own opinion about how you should pitch the narrative and content of your book.
Yeah, Petra Reski, she's written beautiful books about Ndrangheta prisons in Germany. Her experience was that she faced lawsuits for this, and she faced censorship for what she wrote. It's been important for me to speak with her and to visit her in Venice, where she lives. Um, Also because it made me more aware, obviously, of the specific risks involved in writing about the topic.
You tell the story of presenting at a book festival in Germany. Petra presenting and the response in the audience in a particular town, which I have to say, as an author presenting at a book festival, that's pretty challenging environment and maybe unexpected. Say, do you remember the incident very well? I think.
Yes, and she was threatened during that presentation in a very unsettling way. It seemed that the people present had almost been plotting against her and prepared this as a sort of attack against her. Um, what is interesting is that now, so many years later, one of the people that had sued her at the time is now one of the people that has been arrested and is actually on trial in Italy. So sometimes it takes a long time for these things to actually come out and to for her to now perhaps be proven right about what she wrote. And this only emphasizes the importance of free press and the importance of protection of journalists, I think, especially related to this topic. I do realize that the German laws are different from the Dutch laws, and there's a lot more protection of privacy, which is a very helpful situation for Ndrangheta members, of course.
One really interesting, in some ways frightening part of the book is you talk about the Ndrangheta and politics. Of course, you talk about it in Calabria and Italy, but you also talk about it and around a European level, so infiltration. And you make the point, I guess for Calabria and Italy at least, but with implications for Europe, that there are a number of higher level silent partners, let's say. You don't say it exactly like that, but I think that's the implication, that the Ndrangheta has very senior level political connections, not all of which are visible, and there's not always evidence to show that. Is that the case? Have I captured the message that you wanted to send through the book correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I find it very interesting. What there's a specific anti-mafia prosecutor working in Calabria, Giuseppe Lombardo, who I've spoken about in the book. I've interviewed him extensively, and he deals with this, exposing this kind of ecosystem in Calabria very much in his work. And he has been partly successful in revealing these connections to very respected people in society in Calabria. Of course, in a way, it is to be expected because we're speaking about um, mafia organizations as organizations that are defined by their political and economic power in a way. Otherwise, they would be mafias, right? So this aspect is to be expected, but he speaks about it in a way that is interesting because he um, emphasizes the importance they have for their organizational structure, and he's trying to prove this aspect too. And it sounds a little bit like a complot theory when you speak about this. So it's very tricky territory. But he's been able to prove the existence of these figures and their importance for the Ndrangheta up until now. This is an ongoing process, and I think the some of the convictions are only in first instance at this point. One of the figures that have been convicted in these trials is, for instance, the priest of the village of San Luca. So that's an interesting fact. This priest that was also a very important figure for the people involved in the feud of San Luca, and actually related to one of the to some of the people that died in the massacre, if I'm correct.
And you talk about the priests, but the sort of higher level figures are at more senior level in politics, in government, and in the criminal justice system, judges. And I think as you've carefully stated it, it's easy to verge into a bigger conspiracy, but there's clearly evidence of higher forms of protection for the Ndrangheta, and your book covers that well. One thing that's really fascinating in the book, you talk about Pope Francis. He arrives in Calabria and lots of people gather around, and he says something very interesting. The Ndrangheta is the worship of evil and the contempt of the common good. You've pointed to the priest in San Luca. The connections between the Catholic Church and the Mafia is covered in the book.
Yes, it was very interesting to be present that day when the Pope visited Calabria, and because it felt like a very revolutionary thing to do. What he was doing at the time was, I think it was the first time that a Pope actually spoke explicitly about the Ndrangheta, and then he was doing this in Calabria. What he did that day was excommunicate the Ndrangheta. So he was telling people it was not allowed to be both a mafioso and a Catholic, in a sense. And i- as obvious as this may sound to some, it is, of course, the reality is very different. And so this was unprecedented and very important, I think, for Calabrian society, for exposing this. He was exposing the complicity of the church um, with the power that Ndrangheta clans have over certain territories in Calabria. It was an important moment, I think, for Calabria. And because, of course, the way the mafia uses these Christian symbolism is to legitimate itself. And this can be done through carrying around the statues during processions or in other ways using Catholic symbolism in their own rituals. Um, so the way the Pope exposed this toxic connection was very important and significant, I think.
You talk at different points in the book, and actually you've hinted about it in relation to local journalists, about the resilience of local Italian communities, people coming out in public opposing the Ndrangheta and standing up quite courageously. What do you think that takes? Why do you think that occurs in some communities and not in others? What do people talk about it? Could you speak to people about that in the long period that you'd lived in Calabria?
Yeah, it's becoming more and more easy, I think, to speak about it with people. What is interesting to me is that, of course, you have the instances of people maybe speaking out and refusing to pay protection money. Um, what makes these acts even more courageous in Calabria is that there's often a lack of institutional support for these people, and therefore the communities around them are even more important. So what is very important in order to make this resistance happen, I think, is for these kinds of people to have a support system. So it really depends on a sort of sense of community in these areas. And of course, the amount of fear and the amount of mafia presence differs from place to place in Calabria. Um, it's hard to say what is necessary. I mean, these acts of resistance can come up at any time and any moment. I think, as long as there is enough willingness and energy to do it and support. But an interesting aspect, I think, in these anti-mafia sort of uh, initiatives, even associations that are being set up, most often by very young people as well, is that they do not call themselves anti-mafia associations so much. So they keep this explicit. And there may be various reasons for this. They may want to avoid provoking certain people in the community, but also I think it reveals that a lot of the time what they do is take care of the environment. They take care of the community. They remind people that it's our shared responsibility to take care of the natural surroundings, to take care of the cultural traditions, to take care of the community itself. And this exact sort of attitude really helps to oppose or to avoid the grip that the negative influence of the mafia can have on these same communities, I think.
It's almost like what you're saying, this broader resilience. It's a broader community resilience that's required, whether on social issues, environmental issues, or the like, rather than just specific, I suppose, anti-mafia style, more direct organizations. And this comes through very well in the book. I must say, Sanne, can I ask? I mean, you've said you're an outsider. Did you feel threatened yourself? Were you threatened? Has anyone, as a result of the book, threatened you, or you haven't experienced any of that in the period in which you've done the research, which is clearly a very long period, and then been presenting and engaging around the book?
There have been instances of uncomfortable um, encounters. Um, but it's been a very I think it's very typical of the Ndrangheta to be quite subtle in this respect. So I must say, I think when I was writing the book, I had no idea really. It felt like a bit of an experiment to be able to do this as a first foreign journalist living in Calabria. I wasn't sure about, well, whether I had enough sensibility to make the best decisions, because of course my purpose or the intention of the book was certainly not to provoke intimidation or violence, because what I would like to do is prove with the book that it's definitely possible to write about these issues. So I feel even have a responsibility to show that it is possible. I wrote about my personal life. I wrote about the village where I live. I name a lot of the locations and the people and the families that I cover a lot of very different figures in the mafia, and I name them by their name. I did avoid, however, naming the village where I live in Calabria, naming the families involved there, because that was something that I was explicitly warned about and told by also just friends and other and journalists that this was a sort of probably a very smart choice not to be explicit about. So it's very difficult sometimes to answer this question about regarding the risks of this work and the decisions I've made, and I do not want to give too much attention to it either. Um, but I I guess I've made what was important for me is to talk about um, these dynamics, the mafia power, the way it can influence the societies further away, but also nearer to our homes. And I wanted to try and find a way, the right way to do that, for people also to be inspired to do something against it and not to be afraid of doing something against it.
The book's it's got a lot of material. So I guess the obvious question is, you've mentioned some of this, but you've read a lot. There's a list of books in the back. You've interviewed a lot of people. You've looked at a lot of court cases. What was the decisions you made about arranging the material? We've spoken about the Duisburg Mafia as a kind of a thread that runs, that appears at different places, that ties it together, the connections to the Netherlands, Germany. I mean, how did you make those choices? Did you have to leave things out? Were there frustrations? I think there's always frustrations in putting together a book like this. You know, how was the process of both researching it and then writing it?
Well, when I started writing it, I had already accumulated a lot of material. So it was more about choosing what a reader could handle, basically.
Handle what you mean in terms of just detail, that there's like so many stories to tell. Is that what you mean?
Right. There's a lot of, and what is very lucky for people who are like me, who were able to use the material of court documents in the Italian court documents, is that they're full of detail. So the information that I had gathered from interviews, from just observing reality, from all kinds of material that I had gathered, that allowed me to write 10 books maybe. So I tried to organize the material, I think mostly chronologically, and it turned out while I was writing it, this decision allowed me to treat the subject very organically and very truthfully as it happened in my own life. I didn't have to bend reality to my narrative, and it was very it was a great relief also to find that this was possible while I was writing it. And it helped me also come to sometimes well, I don't want to talk about like the therapeutic aspect of writing, but it did definitely help to make sense of what had happened to me and make sense of the decisions that I was making about it, and had been faced with also during these years in Calabria.
What do you, I mean, the series is about interviewing people who've written non-fiction books on organized crime. What do you think the value of that is? You've obviously done it, so you think there's value, but having now done it and reflecting on that, you've talked about your engagements with Dutch law enforcement, for example, people coming up to you and talking about the book. What do you think is the value of this beyond just journalism covering the issues?
What I wanted to do with the book was to really try to make a book that was not about um, sensationalism. Um, the cover slightly the cover of the English version, I must say, slightly it does not bring this across.
Authors don't always like their covers, I think was probably the truth. So it's anyway, carry on.
I can show you the versions in Dutch, but this is probably a podcast that's mostly listened to. But the versions in Dutch and German are very different. They're more like.
Do you have them there, Sanne? Do you have them close by?
Should I? Yes. Should I show them?
Yes, get them. That's good. Yeah.
So this is the original Dutch version. There's actually which is more like a travel book, and this is the German version that is smartly.
More an octopus.
Yes, the La Piovra. It's a reference to La Piovra that a lot of people know this series about the mafia.
And you think the Anglo-Saxon? You think English-speaking people need a more dramatic, blood-filled cover?
It appears that my publisher decided that was necessary. Yes, and it's there's a bit of a tension, I think, with the actual contents of the book, in that I wanted to shy away from a sensationalist sort of attitude, and I really wanted to stress that this is about a beautiful place, a beautiful region of Italy that has been unfortunate in that it has had its government, its local government, its regional government, and also national government compromised in a sense that allowed this mafia influence to grow, and that allowed it to keep it small, and to keep the people, in a sense, isolated from each other. And so it's about people's struggles, it's about their daily lives, it's about also a, a, a problem of framing in the media. It's about misconceptions about what mafia is. It's very important, I think, for me to stress that that mafia groups are becoming. There's less and less killings in Italy, even in recent years. But that does not mean that the mafia has become less prominent in society, or less influential in creating economic and democratic situations that are not actually good for most of the population.
Well, you cover some of the follow-on events in the Netherlands, the assassination of a journalist, other cases, again, very much connecting cocaine trafficking, Rotterdam, the threat to your own country, and the role of the Ndrangheta. I mean, after finishing the book and presenting, and some time has gone past, obviously, since you've written it, are you more pessimistic, optimistic about the growth of the mafia in Europe, in your engagements? Does it still worry you?
Yes, it does worry me. I think like I said, I think I've become more realistic about the challenges we're dealing with, the current impossibility with our current system of fighting crime, to really fight these criminal networks efficiently and in the long term, let's say. But I do see that a lot of people are involved in thinking about how to improve the situation, both in the Netherlands and in other countries, and definitely also in Italy. I see how journalists keep reporting about the issue. That makes me hopeful, and it makes me inspired, I think, to continue to speak about the subject. I do believe that indifference is um, something we should all watch out for. So it's challenging sometimes to be both realistic and not become, in a way, indifferent, because you see how challenging the situation is. But it's I'm not an indifferent person, and I will not become a cynic. So that helps.
Sanne De Boer, thank you so much. There you go. The English-speaking cover, redder than the others, Mafiopoli. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me on the podcast today, Sanne. We're really grateful, and thank you for your work. Are you working on other issues in the sort of mafia sphere at the moment, or you want to write on other topics?
I'm currently writing a new book, and Yes, it's about. It's difficult to say what it's about because while you're in such a project, it's one big chaos of topics and angles. But I think I've hinted to what it's about during this interview.
Great, Sanne. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking.
Thank you.